quick disclaimer. This show is for educational and entertainment purposes only. We do not recommend or endorse any healthcare providers or treatment. The use of information presented on this podcast is at the listener's own risk. And finally, the views expressed by the hosts of this podcast do not represent the views of any official organization or institution. Welcome to the External Medicine Podcast, where we explore ideas currently on the outskirts of medicine. I am Daniel Belkin, and this is Mitch Belkin. We are medical students. I'm at the Albert Einstein College of Medicine. And where do you go, Mitch?
The esteemed University of Maryland School of Medicine.
So do you want to tell people to sign up for our newsletter, or should I?
Please remember to subscribe to our podcast wherever you get your podcasts. And if you're interested, we have a newsletter. We send out weekly updates. You can sign up at externalmedicinepodcast.com.
All right. Who are we going to talk to today?
So today, we interview an economist from George Mason University who has written a lot about healthcare. Professor Alex Tabarrok is the Bartley J. Madden Chair in Economics at the Mercatus Center and a professor of economics at George Mason University. He's the co-author of the popular economics blog, Marginal Revolution, and co-founder of Marginal Revolution University. He is the author of numerous academic papers in the fields of law, economics, criminology, regulatory policy, voting theory, and other areas in political economy. His articles have appeared in the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, among many, many other publications.
This podcast was recorded on May 2nd. In this interview, Professor Tabarrok discusses what an economist can bring to discussions of the pandemic, the U.S. government's response to COVID-19, the performance of the FDA and the CDC, regulatory nationalism, the First Dose is First campaign, and why America should vaccinate the world. And so without further ado, we bring you Professor Alex Tabarrok. Professor Tabarrok, welcome to the External Medicine Podcast. Thank you for joining us today.
It's great to be here.
Before we begin, do you have any financial disclosures?
None that I could think of.
All right. For those who aren't familiar with your work, how would you describe what you do?
So I'm an economist. I write regularly on my blog with Tyler Cowan about economics. We've been doing that for 18 years. I'm also a textbook author. I write academic articles. I've been studying the FDA and medical decisions for a long time. So that's kind of a little bit of an overview.
You've written a lot about COVID-19 over the last year. What perspective do you think an economist brings to the table that an epidemiologist, a physician, or a scientist might not bring?
Right. So I think a key issue has been trade-offs. We're in a situation where we have to evaluate decisions under uncertainty. There's risk in both sides. I'm sure we'll talk about, for example, like delaying the second dose. And you have to think about trade-offs. You got to think about, which risk is bigger, when is it worth making these trade-offs, expected values. So all of these things, making decisions under uncertainty is something which economists study and tend to be pretty good at. So that's kind of my perspective.
So how has the COVID-19 pandemic shaped your views? Has it changed any of your fundamental beliefs?
Right. Well, let me give you a background of how I got involved in this. I was asked to give a talk to the Council of Economic Advisors and the Domestic Policy Council of the White House. This was very early on in the crisis. And it turned out at this talk to be me and Michael Kremer. Michael Kremer, Nobel Prize winner. And one of the things he is recognized for in his Nobel Prize, was helping to develop the pneumococcus vaccine using incentives with Bill Gates, an early advanced market commitment. So he was like the number one person in the world. So it turned out that we were very much in agreement at this meeting about what to do. Namely, it was very easy to run a calculation showing that the coronavirus, the COVID epidemic was killing the economy. I mean, it's been estimated, the IMF estimated that on a world scale, this was causing losses of 500 billion a month. And if you extend the economic losses to take into account losses from health and losses from less education and so forth, then the costs are even higher than that. So when you're talking about trillions, losing trillions of dollars every couple of months, then it became very obvious that almost anything you could do to shorten the crisis would be extremely valuable. So at this meeting of the Domestic Policy Council and the CEA, I said, look, I'm kind of a conservative, sort of free market economist, whatever. Listen, I've never said these words before in my entire life, but now is the time to throw money at the problem. Okay. So Creamer and I both said, listen, start throwing money at vaccines. And we outlined a proposal to do that. And then later on, we were asked to write a report and joined by a number of other top economists. Michael got out his Rolodex or his database and called his friends. We had a bunch of top economists. We wrote a report for the US government, and then another one for the British government. And we started working with the World Bank and other institutions around the world. And if you could just put one lesson on it, that was it, that the shortening the crisis by even a few months would be worth hundreds of billions, if not trillions of dollars. So we were very much in support of doing that. We were talking about investing on the order of 150 billion to invest in about 18 vaccine candidates. Now, the world did not go as big as we wanted. The US was by far the best with Operation Warp Speed. They invested about 15 billion. The rest of the world, Europe, 1 or 2 billion, Great Britain, 1 or 2 billion, not nearly as much as we wanted. But in a paper which came out in Science, we calculate that the investments which we did make were worth on the order of $2 trillion. So we're extremely, extremely valuable. And we have been arguing since then that we could do even more. So let me stop there. I've gone on too long, but that was my basic message to policymakers, is that anything we can do to shorten the crisis would be extremely valuable.
Why do you think policymakers in the US were more receptive to spending, granted not as receptive as you and Michael Creamer would have wanted?
Yeah, it's a good question, because everywhere we went, we kind of faced sticker shock. People just, put up there, oh, we can't spend that much money. Where are we going to find that much money? This is very, very peculiar because A, the numbers to us were so clear, but B, people were able to spend, on unemployment insurance or on the, small business loan programs, things like that. And it just seemed that it was very difficult for people to imagine a new source of spending. There was no button, unlike unemployment insurance, there was no button to press. Now, why in the United States, why was the United States better than Europe? And in Europe in particular, as is sort of known now, they spent weeks like dickering over the price, right? We calculate that each course of vaccine was worth, beginning in January, on the order of like $1,000 or more. And here the EU has been dickering, over a vaccine which costs, $8 and getting down to $6. It's just crazy, right? Now, why? Well, I'm not sure. I think partly, maybe, Trump had very few good things, I thought, but this idea of vaccines for some reason got in his head, and maybe he was supportive in a way which he was not for tests, and maybe even the name Operation Warp Speed. I mean, it's amazing how much these things can actually make a difference. But people like that. The FDA turned out to be in favor. The FDA has done many, many things which were wrong, which were bad, but they were pretty good on Operation Warp Speed. And the European Union was just much, much more risk averse as well. They didn't put a lot of money behind it. They didn't reduce liability concerns. They didn't trust the firms, I think, as much. So the US put more faith, I think, in capitalism or private firms' initiative, and Europe was a little bit more hesitant, except for Britain, right? Britain did everything pretty much very well as well. But why? It's very difficult, I think, to understand these differences.
You mentioned the EU trying to get the price down from $8 to $6. I was watching a video of you explaining the concept of externalities and how trying to haggle the price down from $8 to $6 out of fear of price gouging, essentially by producers of vaccines, sort of prevents people from seeing the larger picture of the true benefits that come from vaccination. Could you just explain what are externalities and the application to this particular case?
Sure. So when you take a vaccine, as you know, you get some benefit for yourself. You're less likely to get disease, but you're also less likely to transmit the disease. And you may count the benefits to yourself, what you're willing to do to get the vaccine, but you're probably going to underinvest or undercount the fact that you're not going to transmit the vaccine. You're not going to give the vaccine to other people. So we say this is a positive externality. It means that as an individual, you probably won't invest as much time and energy in getting a vaccine as we would like for the social good, to benefit everybody. So this is one reason you want to keep vaccine prices low. That is, you want to pay the companies. Let's make a distinction very clear. You want to give lots of money to the companies so that they produce the vaccine, but you want to keep the price low to consumers. You want to subsidize the price, make it free. Right now, even in West Virginia, they're giving you a $100 bond if you get vaccinated. And that's a recognition of the externalities, that there's benefits to other people. So we're going to give you this $100 in addition to the benefits to yourself. And the EU, yeah, as you said, they were perhaps so much in the frame that we are the type of place which bargains with the pharmaceutical companies to keep prices low, that they applied the same reasoning to vaccines when the vaccines were already incredibly cheap relative to the value. So it was a case of, penny wise and pound foolish, except the British were actually smart. But yeah, they lost sight of the big picture, which was that the vaccines were incredibly valuable in getting the economy going again.
So now let's talk a little bit about the CDC and the FDA. What do you think the CDC and the FDA have done well over the last year? And what could they have done better?
So let me put it this way. Speaking about the FDA first, relative to their previous behavior, they have been much faster. So you can take that both as a compliment and as an insult, depending upon your point of view, because they did speed the approval of vaccines much quicker than they ordinarily would have. But they were still too slow, in my view. Like even the time that they took to approve the Pfizer vaccine after the Pfizer submitted the EUA, and then they took 3 weeks to schedule a meeting, and then a couple days after that, and Trump had to yell at them, and there was all of that. Now 3 weeks is an incredibly short period of time. So kudos to them for getting on the ball and doing that, but they could have started a rolling review much earlier. And 3 weeks in the context of the pandemic in December, which was one of the deadliest months in the United States. That was when the people were going home for Thanksgiving and for Christmas, and the infections and the fatality, the infections were skyrocketing exponentially. And of course, deaths followed soon after that. So those 3 weeks, while it seems like a short period of time, in the context of an exponentially growing deadly virus, it was about 67,000 people died during those 3 weeks. So that was a very consequential delay.
What do you make of the argument that they needed that time to make sure all the T's were crossed and the I's dotted. They didn't want to release a vaccine that could have some serious side effect. Why is it that you believe that they could have done that in a shorter period of time?
Right. So the FDA is continually in discussions with the pharmaceutical companies. So it's not like they were literally had nothing, and then the day the Pfizer submits the EUA, they've got all this stack of papers. They could have been, and in fact they were, but they could have been reviewing much earlier and doing a rolling review. So also, yes, of course, it's important to have a second pair of eyes in addition to the eyes of the manufacturer look over the data. That's valuable, but you always have to balance these things and look at the trade-offs. Like 3 weeks, if it's an acne medicine, okay, take 3 weeks, hell, take 6 weeks. The teenager angst could be bad, but it's not, don't worry, teenagers, you'll get over it, right? But in the context of a disease which was killing people at 2,000 to 3,000 people a day, was this really worth it, right? So they found nothing in those 3 weeks. They found nothing untoward. What was the probability that they were going to find something, which would have said, okay, no, we're not going to approve it? What was the probability that they were going to find something which said that they were not going to approve? It was really low. So you had to sort of multiply that probability by the number of deaths which could be avoided if you allowed the vaccine to be out on the market a little bit sooner. And then, of course, you could have allowed it. Pfizer could have started shipping it out to the pharmacies, and then you could have withdrawn it if it was really so bad. So looking at the costs and benefits, I think the costs of the delay were far, far in excess of the benefits.
What do you think about the FDA's decision to pause the Johnson & Johnson vaccine for, I think it was a couple of weeks?
Yeah, so I think this wasn't again, let me put it in a way which you can interpret however you want, which is to say that this wasn't the worst decision the FDA made, all right? So I think a bulletin would have been fine because, look, there was really never any doubt or very little doubt that the benefits of the vaccine were far in excess of the costs, of the dangers, of the risks. Even if you took as the danger, to being, 1 in 100,000 of developing a blood clot or something like that, 1 in 125,000, something like that. Even if you took those costs and you assumed that those were accurate numbers and so forth, much, much worse to get COVID. COVID creates many more blood clots, is much more likely to create blood clots than is any of the vaccines. So I thought putting out a bulletin just to tell doctors, listen, there's a possible rare side effect. Be on the lookout for these kinds of symptoms. Here's what you do. Here's what you do. Don't give heparin, right? If you had in this situation, and so forth. I think a bulletin would have been fine. The pause, I think, was really sort of unnecessary. It looks like the pause created some vaccine hesitancy. In general, I'm against the FDA even taking into account sort of vaccine hesitancy, just because I don't think they understand the psychology. I don't understand the psychology of it all. So I think the FDA should just make the right decision based upon the merits, based upon the cost-benefit analysis. But as it turns out, it looks like the number of vaccinations dropped sharply beginning with the J&J pause. And it dropped sharply in all age groups across the board. So it looks like a fairly negative decision. We don't know what would have happened had they just done a bulletin. I think it probably would have been better, but no one knows for sure.
You mentioned previously that the FDA did not take into consideration a sort of cost-benefit analysis. Do you have any indication that they are actually running the numbers on that?
Yeah, they don't run the numbers. And just in their rhetoric, right? You can see this is always, safety first, gold standard, and so forth. And look, safety is always a relative term, right? a drug is neither safe nor unsafe. It all depends upon how you use it and relative to what, right? So, if I were to take, a blood thinning drug, right? That's what, when I don't need it, then that's a very unsafe drug for me. For somebody who has some particular disease, then it's a safer drug for them than dealing with the disease. So you're always balancing, and this is what physicians do. This is what physicians have to do on a daily basis, right? Is to think about what are the side effects of the drug? Where is this person in the progression of the disease? What should we do first? What is our first line of attack? What is our second line of attack? If that doesn't work, what is our third line of attack? You take your gold standard first, right? And you do what is safest first. And if that doesn't work, then you might try something which is a little bit more unsafe, a little bit more risky, which has a little bit less of an evidence base. You might do that second or third, when the first couple of treatments have failed. The FDA generally does not look at things in this way. And there's a reason for that. And the reason is that if the FDA approve a bad drug, then heads roll, right? Then they look bad. Then there are Congress has hearings, and people die, and they go on television and they say, "I die," or my family died, my mother died, my brother died because the FDA approved this bad drug. If the FDA instead delays a good drug, well, people still die. People die who would have lived. And I say they end up in the invisible graveyard. It's an invisible graveyard. People don't see it. It's a statistical fact that they're there, but it's very difficult to say that, Paul Jones, who lived at 123 Main Street, he died because this drug was not available, right? Very difficult to say that. His family don't protest. Hearings are not held. And so the FDA is very much biased towards avoiding approving a bad drug, and they are much, much more likely, therefore, to fail to approve a good drug. And that has been true with COVID. It's been true with testing, but it's also true across the FDA's board. They're too conservative. They're too conservative. And in part, it's the public's fault. It's not just the FDA's fault. The FDA is following their incentives, but their incentives are not to minimize patient death. Their incentives are to minimize patient death caused by approving a bad drug, which is a very different thing than minimizing patient death or mortality or morbidity overall.
Do you have any ideas of how you could change those incentives to be more along the lines of what you would want?
Yeah, it's a very difficult question because, as I mentioned briefly, a lot of it is due just to the public. The public doesn't see the invisible graveyard. That's why it's invisible, right? And one of the silver linings, perhaps, of COVID is that I think we are more aware that FDA delay can kill, right? I think we're more aware of that now, or the public is more aware of it than they were before. But in general, that's a very difficult thing to get the public to understand. Now, the FDA used to only have approval authority over safety, prior to 62, and maybe we should pull back on what the FDA is allowed to evaluate.
It was safety until 62, and what is it since?
Safety and efficacy. Yeah, there are a lot of other institutions in the medical system which evaluate the efficacy of drugs, including the HMOs, the hospitals, peer-reviewed literature, physicians, and so forth. And you actually see this again. This is something your audience probably understands very well, but the whole practice of off-label prescribing. So once a drug has been approved for some use, it can be used for any use. And it often happens that a drug is approved for one use, and it's then discovered that this drug can be very useful against some other disease, which is quite different than the one for which it was approved. And physicians can and do prescribe drugs off-label for diseases for which that drug was never approved. And that is actually a very vital and important part of medicine. So the gold standard treatment in many cutting edge fields for AIDS and cancer and so forth is often a off-label prescription. And so that shows you that physicians are able to prescribe drugs even when they haven't gone through the entire FDA process for efficacy.
I was seeing a few ear surgeries, and the ENT physician was saying that pretty much all of the drops that they use in ears, they didn't do studies in ears. Those come from studies done in eyes, but they know that it works for ears and they just use all of the same drops.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So this is a good segue into talking about regulatory nationalism. So you've been making this case for many, many years now, and recently you've been talking about vaccine nationalism, but I feel like it's the structure of the argument is the same. So can you tell us what regulatory nationalism is and why you are against it?
Sure. So one kind of, I think, small but useful FDA reform, which I have argued for, is allowing any drug or device which has been approved by a stringent regulator, say by the EU or by the UK or Japan, to automatically be approved in the United States within, say, 60 days or something like that, if the FDA does not object. Okay. But it would make the approval automatic if it's been approved somewhere else. So the FDA would have to say, do something. And that to me is just like common sense, right? If a drug is good enough for the Germans, it's good enough for me, right? And if I lived in Germany, the FDA likes to say we are the gold standard, but patients in Germany, when their doctor prescribes a drug, they don't ask their physician, Herr Physician, has this drug been approved by the gold standard FDA? They trust the European Medical Authority, as they well should. And so, and I would trust the European Medical Authority if I lived in Germany. So why don't I trust it if I live in the United States? Well, actually, I do. I would be very happy to take any drug or device which has been approved in the EMA, which has been approved by the EMA. I would be totally happy if my physician said, here's a drug. It hasn't been approved by the FDA, but it's been approved by the EMA. Do you want it? I'd say, bring it on. I got no problem. With that. And in fact, it's not uncommon for some drugs and devices, which are quite useful, to be available in Europe and not available here. Sunscreens are much better in Europe. We have not improved our standards for sunscreens in the United States for 40 years. So we are using technology for sunscreen, which is like 40 years old. The Europeans have much more advanced sunscreens, and most, I want to say epidemiologists, but that of course is incorrect. Epidermiologists, is that who it is? You tell me.
Dermatologists?
Yeah, dermatologists, yes, excuse me. Yeah, I got confused about epidermis and all stuff like that. Yeah, so the dermatologists say that the European sunscreens are better. And people, the sun worshippers, they bring it in from Europe, and they go through special websites to get in their favorite sunscreens. And sometimes happens the other way too. I don't want to say that the FDA is uniformly worse than the EMA, because the FDA sometimes approves drugs and devices before the Europeans do. And then the Europeans equally well should say, well, it's been approved by the FDA, I should be able to use it too. And I'm fine with that as well.
People probably, when you talk about this argument, will bring up like thalidomide,
sure,
and stuff. What do you say to people who say, oh, well, if we had done what Europe had done with that, we would have had, many more deformed babies in the US?
Sure. So there's two things. First, this indicates regulatory nationalism, which I didn't quite close the circle, which is that people have this weird idea that my country is the best, right? And that can't possibly be true. It can't possibly be true that the American standards are the best, and Germany, thinks the Germans think their standards are the best, and Americans think their standards are the best. At least one of them has got to be wrong, right? Probably both of them, but at least one of them has got to be wrong. So I do think we should kind of put aside our nationalism and, think more clearly about who has the scientific wherewithal to evaluate drugs, and the Europeans are very good at that. By the way, we actually do this for food. So the United States recognizes that Canada's food safety system is at least as good as the US's food safety system. It can be a little bit different, but it's at least as good. And so for our food safety, we have deals with Canada where we don't have to double check everything. If it passed the Canadian safety standards, it passes ours. If food passes our standards, it passes the Canadian safety standards. So this idea of peer authority and is not unknown. And I'm just saying we should apply it to drugs and devices as well as to food. I've been going on too long, but let me just briefly talk about thalidomide, because I mentioned earlier the invisible graveyard, right? So I said that the invisible graveyard is where people go to die where they would have lived had this drug been approved. And it's invisible. So I asked you, well, name a drug which has killed people because it wasn't approved. And you go, people in the street, they don't know. If I instead asked, name a drug which killed people, which was approved, thalidomide, right? So this shows you the bias. This shows you the bias because everybody can name, everyone sees the disaster which occurs when a bad drug is approved, and they don't see the disaster which has occurred when good drugs are delayed or made so expensive that they are never even actually produced. And yet there are, in fact, many people buried in the invisible graveyard.
What would you say to someone who then hearing that argument would say, well, maybe it's worse to have some sort of iatrogenic harm? I feel like that calculation that you're doing is a very utilitarian one where you just measure the numbers, but maybe it's worse for the government to say,
right,
to approve a drug and then have that drug kill people than to have more people die otherwise. I mean, that's not how I feel, but what would you say to that?
Right. Yeah, no, I think people do feel that way. And this is going back to, what does an economist have to bring to this debate? Economists, you're right, are utilitarian. And I'll say I suppose, this is a one aspect of the omission-commission bias, right? That an era of commission, one where you have approved a bad drug, is somehow worse than an era of omission where you failed to approve a good drug. This, by the way, is one thing which accounts for vaccine hesitancy, right? Because people feel that if I gave my kid a vaccine or I allowed my child to have a vaccine and then the vaccine did something bad, I would feel much worse than if I don't give the kid a vaccine and then he gets some disease which kills him, right? Okay. And you can, because you can kind of say, well, if I said he could have the vaccine and the vaccine harmed him, it's my fault. But if I said he can't have the vaccine and the disease harms him, well, that's nature. That was just randomness. Now, that's crazy, right? That's crazy. That's bad parenting in my view, okay? That's bad parenting. So what I would advise that parent is to look at the benefits of the vaccine and look at the safety profile and look at the disease and your chances of getting the disease and make the choice which is going to be the best choice for your child. Which in the case of COVID means, probably, getting the vaccine, probably. It's certainly for adults, they should get the vaccine. It's much, much better to get the vaccine than it is to get COVID. So I would say ignore the omission-commission bias. That's like egotistical, right? To think that your decision is the only thing which morally matters. No, what morally matters is the consequences. Okay, is your child alive or dead? And just choose the option which is best, has the expected benefits which are highest. And I think the same thing is true for drugs and devices and so forth. So yeah, the FDA is much more worried about errors of commission than errors of omission. And I think that is a mistake. That's like bad parenting. And they should just do the thing which maximizes expected benefits.
What would you say are the best arguments in favor of regulatory nationalism?
I think it's good to have competition. So I do worry a little bit that if we had peer review, if we allowed, as I said, drugs approved in the European Union to be approved here, that would evolve towards like one regulatory authority, which I don't really want. Okay, so you can kind of see that it might evolve in that way, and I would be a little bit worried about that, because I do think that being able to see what other countries are doing and how other people or other countries are making different decisions I think is very useful. It's part of the, laboratories of democracy. We usually apply that phrase to federalism within the United States, but it also applies to the world as a whole. Seeing what other countries do can inform your own views a bit more. To give you one example, going the other way, which is not usually what I do, but the Germans are much more worried about melatonin than we are in the United States. Like in the United States, you get like 3 milligrams, 5 milligrams of it, which is way too much, way too much. And the Europeans are going like, well, are you guys crazy? This is a hormone. Why are you allowing, people to, pop these hormones as if it were nothing? And so like, I just, take that into my own head as maybe I should go a little bit lower, go a much lower dose on the melatonin, because that's what the Germans do. So I think we're something to learn from competition.
I want to move on to first doses first, but before we do, just you talked mostly about the FDA. I was wondering if you wanted to comment at all on the CDC over the last year, things that they did well and things that you think that they should or should have done differently.
Yeah, I mean, the CDC has been a disaster. They botched the first test for COVID. And then that was compounded by the FDA saying that private companies could not offer their own tests. Ordinarily, private companies are allowed to develop their own tests and start using them. But because this was declared an emergency, they now had to go to the FDA for authorization first. So we did precisely the wrong thing. We slowed things down because this was emergency instead of speeding things up. So in South Korea, faced with the same situation, the South Korean government got all of the test manufacturers together in a room, which was like literally at the train station, because they didn't even want to take the time to go to a hotel. So just got everyone together at the train station, found a room, and what they told them was, listen, start producing these tests. Okay, we will approve them later. Just start producing them now. So South Korea, because they got testing going much earlier, was able to get ahead of the virus. And due to the CDC botching the first test and then the FDA preventing private companies from using their own tests and the state governments from using their own tests, that really put us back crucial weeks. What else? Then the CDC, I don't think, I mean, it is amazing that the entire purpose of the CDC, right, has been to deal with a pandemic. This is the reason they were created. This is their reason d'etre, right? This is their fundamental goal. And yet, because we didn't have a pandemic, a serious one in the United States for a long time, the CDC just had bureaucracy creep. They just started getting into areas which are well beyond their fundamental goal for being, like getting into vaping. Okay, the CDC should not be dealing with vaping. It's ridiculous. Or guns. No matter what your perspective on guns, whether they're bad or good or Second Amendment or whatever. Look, this is not the CDC's job. Okay, and when you have the CDC spending lots of resources, and people say, oh, the CDC budget was cut. It's total nonsense. The CDC had plenty of budget, but they were spending so much effort and time and personnel on things which were far away from their fundamental goal that I think they lost sight of it and they became complacent. And so they haven't been very good in the pandemic. I don't think their communication with the public has been very good. They had this whole crazy thing where they said, masks are not useful, right? And then we learned much later that masks, in fact, are useful. Fauci sort of said, well, this was a noble lie, right? We had to say this so that we would reserve masks for, the physicians. And I just think that lying to the public like that, whether noble or not, is just not a good idea. And I think the CDC has just been they haven't been communicating very well.
So you mentioned mission creep at CDC and expanding into other areas like vaping and guns, but you also mentioned the fact that the CDC has not had to deal with a pandemic domestically. And in a once in a century kind of situation, I imagine it would be very difficult for a bureaucratically structured organization to cope. So I guess my question to you is how much of this do you think is mission creep versus lack of experience with the specific situation that COVID brought about?
Yeah, that's a very good point. And I think it's very puzzling how different countries have reacted and why some countries appear to be better in some areas and worse in some areas. And, what explains this? I mean, there was a survey before the pandemic which said, like, the US is the #1 country to deal with the pandemic. Right? They have the best, and you look at sort of the state capacity literature, political science, and, the US has got all this power and they can do these things. And, it turned out it was a total failure. What countries succeeded? I mean, South Korea succeeded, Taiwan succeeded, New Zealand, Australia, pretty good. One of the things, particularly with the Asian countries, I think was experience, exactly what you mentioned. They had a much more serious, with the avian flu and SARS-CoV-1 and so forth, MERS, it was much more touch and go in those countries. And because of that experience, I do think they were able to push a button. They knew what to do. They had procedures in place. Yeah, so I'm sympathetic to the point of view which you're taking, which is that experience matters a huge amount. And it's very difficult to deal with these low probability, high consequence events. Human beings are just not good at this, right? These things which happen once in a lifetime. In general, human beings are not like saving for your retirement, things like that. Human beings are not that good at that. And let alone dealing with an asteroid strike or a pandemic or a super volcano. We're just not good at that. So I recognize your point there.
So let's talk about first doses first. You were one of the most vociferous proponents of this early on, and slowly it seems like more and more people are agreeing with you. What is the first doses first campaign, I guess, and why do you support it?
Right. So when the initial Pfizer results came out from the clinical trials, I noticed that the first dose appeared on its own to be very effective, about 80%, at least 80% effective. It later turned out that when you look at the effectiveness of the first dose after the first 2 weeks, but before you get the second dose, it's almost like 94 or 93% effective, something on that. The Canadians looked at that because you don't expect it to work within, immediately, right? So you kind of say, well, nothing's going to work in the first 2 weeks. So you take out those 2 weeks and you find that the first dose was very effective. And that I thought was extremely important because it meant that if we delayed the second dose, we could get many more first doses out quickly. And that would be beneficial for two reasons. First, bringing somebody from 0% protected to 80% protected. That I think is much more important than bringing them from 80% protected to sort of 95% protected, especially when you take into account that when you're saying you're bringing them from 0% to 80% protected, what you're really doing, this is speaking a little bit loosely, but what you're really doing, you're protecting them from dying from COVID. When you're bringing them from 80 to 95% protected, you're protecting them from getting the sniffles, right? So the clinical trials indicated this very important fact that, yeah, this might be better for individuals to get more people protected with that first dose. And second, the more people you protect with first doses, the less the transmission. You bring R down, right? So if people who get the first doses were less likely to transmit the disease, even if getting the second dose meant that you were even less likely, right, to transmit the disease, but just getting it out to more people quicker, this could really help to end the crisis quickly. And I think what has happened, so I said that in December, and what has happened is that countries realized much later than I would have liked that these vaccines are scarce, Okay. We don't have enough of these vaccines to go around. So Great Britain and then Canada, they were sort of by force of circumstance, were forced to confront this fact that, we can vaccinate 500,000 people with 2 doses or 1 million people with 1 dose. If you had plenty of vaccines, then go ahead, give everyone 2 doses. I'm not against 2 doses, but this is a situation of scarcity and an emergency. Okay, we were in an emergency when we did not have enough vaccines to go around. And that meant that anything we could do to stretch the doses out, I think, was extremely valuable. And delaying that second dose looked like a smart move.
So just to clarify the argument in favor of first doses first, you're saying in a situation of scarcity, given that the first dose has substantial efficacy, it makes sense to vaccinate the maximum number of people to have some level of efficacy rather than prioritizing certain people to have an even higher level of effectiveness of the vaccine. But just to clarify, you're not saying do not give people the second dose. You're saying they can get the second dose at some later date.
Correct. So again, this is only under a situation of scarcity, right? If we got plenty to go around, which eventually we will, then fine, give everybody a second dose. And I think what the British did, 12 weeks, I think was a reasonable decision. Canada pushed it even a little bit further to 16 weeks. I think as Canada gets more doses, then they will shorten the delay, right? But until you've got plenty of doses, then I think extending the time to give the second dose is smart. And also remember, look, these vaccines were produced under the firms, to their credit, produce these vaccines incredibly quickly, right? And the decision to make the second dose at 3 weeks or 4 weeks, this was not a decision which was made to optimize even individual health, right? They made that decision, was the shortest possible time that they had expected an effect, because they wanted to finish the clinical trials as quickly as possible. I mean, if you'd extended the second dose to 8 weeks, then that's another 4 weeks you have to wait before you can apply to the FDA for an EUA. And that is deadly. That is deadly. Hundreds of thousands of people would die. So shortening the time between doses made perfect sense to get the EUA as quickly as possible, which was totally the right thing to do. But it's not a magical number. Those 3 weeks and that 4 weeks is not a magical number. And in fact, what we discovered in the case of the AstraZeneca vaccine, actually delaying makes the vaccine more effective. Okay, so there's literally no reason not to delay the AstraZeneca vaccine to 12 weeks, because efficacy actually goes up. And that's pretty common for vaccines. Like most vaccines, you don't give the booster shot within 3 or 4 weeks. You might give it 3 or 4 months later. So it's not uncommon for vaccines to have a quite extensive delay between the first shot and the booster shot. And that's often, stimulates the immune system in a more effective way.
What are the best arguments you've heard against first doses first?
So I think one argument is that people will forget to get their second dose. Okay. And, even now in the United States, not everyone is getting their second dose. Of course, that's totally common for vaccines, for people not to follow up with the booster shots. And maybe if you did it within 3 or 4 weeks, or more people would get it. That's a possible argument. People were worried early on about immune escape, that if you delayed the second dose, that would leave more people partially protected, which would allow the virus to mutate. I think that argument now turns out to be minor or wrong, because you also have to take into account that where the virus is mutating is in the unvaccinated population. So when we talk about the South African variant and the Brazilian variant and the Indian variant, those variants are not coming from people who were vaccinated. Those variants are coming from the unvaccinated population. So the more people that you have who are unvaccinated, which is 0% protection. If you think partial protection is bad, well, 0 is better, is worse than 80% protected, right? So if you're worried about partial protection, meaning that the virus mutates, then you want to vaccinate as many people as quickly as possible. So I think what the epidemiologists and the virologists are now coming around to is that actually delaying the second dose can reduce immune escape.
Can you think of some individuals who have actually public figures that have actually changed their mind on first doses first?
Yeah, so I think Atul Gawande changed his mind. Ezekiel Emanuel came out. I'm not sure if he changed his mind, but he more recently he came out for delaying the second dose. The Canadians, changed their mind. So the NACI, their national commission, I think only later came to realize that, listen, we're really faced with a scarcity of vaccines, and it's going to be better for us to get more people vaccinated with the first dose. I think also this is still extremely important. Like in the United States, we're coming to the end of the pandemic, and almost any adult can be vaccinated sort of on demand in the United States right now. So we're coming to the end. So it's not a useful policy for the United States any longer. But the rest of the world is still very much under vaccine scarcity. So there are many, many countries where none or only a tiny fraction of the population have been vaccinated. So for them, stretching doses is going to be vitally important. That could be delaying the second dose. I also think fractional dosing could be extremely, extremely important and useful. We know from the Moderna phase 1 and phase 2 trials that a fractional dose, like a half dose, appears to induce a substantial immune response, almost as large, a robust immune response as the 50 microgram, I think, dose is just as good as the 100 dose. And so if we could do some more studies, or if we, I like put it this way, if we could half the doses, that's equivalent to doubling the number of Moderna and Pfizer factories overnight. So that tells you how valuable this could be. If you could half the doses, that's like $1 trillion or more opportunity. That's many lives potentially to be saved. And I should note, before you think, oh, this is some crazy economist, with this idea of, fractional dosing. No, this has been used in epidemics in the past. So Brazil had a yellow fever outbreak in 2018, and they didn't have enough vaccine to give everybody the full dose. So they went actually to 1/5 doses, and 1/5 doses was enough to break transmission. It was enough to stop it from going exponential, right? So this idea has been used in past pandemics, and I think it has a lot of potential to be used for COVID. And again, remember that the vaccine manufacturers, they weren't trying to optimize, like usually they might optimize, they might do some more studies because they got years to make these vaccines. They might optimize it. Okay, should it be 100 or 75 or 70? But here, right, they just want to go as quickly as possible. Again, to their credit. Thank you, Pfizer. Thank you, Moderna, for doing that. And so they went with a large dose just to make sure that they got one which is going to work. But that's not a magical number. That is not a magical number. People say follow the science as if it means doing exactly what they did in the clinical trials, which is not true at all. When you think about following the science, you have to think about the entire body of evidence which is available to us. And that includes many past pandemics, that includes the phase 1 and phase 2 trials on the immune system response. And it includes thinking about risks and benefits as well. So I think following the science means taking the idea of fractional doses very, very seriously.
Recently, you've been arguing that America should vaccinate the world. What does that look like, and why should we do it?
Correct. So this was something which the team, which was I was involved in, was very much on their minds right from the beginning, because what we advised governments to do was not to buy doses. Okay, what we advised them to do was to invest in capacity, which Operation Warp Speed to some extent did. So Operation Warp Speed paid for the Moderna to build factories. Moderna at the beginning had no factories, had no ability to produce more than just the amount they needed for, like, running their own tests and running their own clinical trials. They had no ability to manufacture at scale. And the United States, Operation Warp Speed, came in and said, we're going to pay for your factories, okay? We're going to pay to run these clinical trials. That was the right thing to do. Well, why? Well, there were a couple of reasons. First, if you just invested in doses, buying doses, then you ran the risk of being pushed to the end of the queue later on. Okay, it was very difficult then to make sure that you would get your doses first. And this is the problem which Canada had. So Canada bought doses. They bought a lot of doses. They were smart, but they ended up being pushed to the back of the queue because they didn't have any capacity. They didn't invest in capacity. So we said invest in capacity, because then it's more credible that you can have these doses produced. Second, what this meant was that once the US wanted capacity to go fast, but once the US is vaccinated, that means that capacity is left over for the rest of the world. So we were thinking very much then, and this is what is now happening, is that the US would invest, go big on capacity, would go fast, and then there would be lots of factories for the rest of the world. It's just starting to happen. So Pfizer right now, just in the past few days, has started to export from the United States. Previously, all of the US Pfizer was going to the United States. But now that the US is got plenty of vaccines, Pfizer is starting to export from its US factories overseas. Okay, so we can vaccinate the world. We have the capacity to do it. Why should we do it? Well, when I spoke before Congress, I said, look, there's at least 3 reasons. First of all, I'm an economist. Let's forget about the humanitarian reason. Okay. Okay. Forget humanitarianism. Okay. Okay. That's not my bailiwick. Okay. We'll let somebody else do humanitarian. Okay. Here's my bailiwick. We have health reasons, economic reasons, and political reasons. Health reasons to stop the variants. So, what I said is, listen, if you were worried about the South African variant and the Brazilian variant, the best way to protect your constituents is to vaccinate South Africans and Brazilians, okay? And now, of course, Indians as well, right? So until everyone is safe, no one is safe. It sounds trite, but it really is true when it comes to a virus. So there are health reasons to do it. Economic reasons. We are part of a globalized economy. So even once we are vaccinated and once other high-income countries are vaccinated, we are still exporting, we are importing, and we are consuming products which are produced using long supply chains involving many countries. So you just look at the supply chain, for the Pfizer vaccine, for example, it's like 70 countries. Right? Or you look at the Apple iPhone, there's like 100 countries are participating in aspects, the chips and the screens and all that in the iPhone. So there's plenty of reasons, economic reasons, to vaccinate the world. And it's cheap. Okay. It's not that expensive to vaccinate the world. Okay. It can be in our economic interests to do this. And then the third reason is political, is that, look, and I told Congress, you want to kind of get as many people on your side as possible, right? So you have to appeal to as many different audiences. So thinking about the foreign policy audience, I said, look, it's a Chinese plan to vaccinate the world or an American plan. And I would prefer there would be an American plan, right? So the Chinese were early, about here's our vaccine, take our vaccine, and using that as a foreign policy gain, as a piece of diplomacy for an authoritarian regime. And I would rather that we have the arsenal of vaccination, I think as Noah Smith put it, the US arsenal of immunity. And we use our arsenal to vaccinate the world. It's going to be a big foreign policy gain. And we have to do it quickly. We got to get moving on this, because there is a perception beginning in the rest of the world that we are vaccine hoarders. It's not actually true. but that perception is growing. And to counter that perception, we really should donate to COVAX and start using our capacity, the Johnson & Johnson vaccine, get the Novavax vaccine online, start producing in mass quantities, and let's have an American plan to vaccinate the world.
Thank you so much for joining us on the External Medicine podcast. If people are interested in learning more about the work that you do, where would you direct them to?
So you can check out my blog, Marginal Revolution. And that's Tyler Cowan and myself. Tyler publishes something every single day. I publish every couple of days, maybe a couple of times a week. Yeah, we've been there a long time, 18 years now, but you keep following Marginal Revolution and you'll get a feel for our personalities and our interests and things like that over time. It's a fun blog, I think.
Thank you so much for joining us. And it was great meeting you.
Thank you for having me. It's been a real pleasure talking to you both.
If you'd like to support us, here are some ways you can help. Subscribe to this podcast wherever you get your podcasts. Leave us a review, preferably a phenomenal review. Visit us at externalmedicinepodcast.com and tell your friends.